Alrighty guys, welcome back to another little video, and today we actually got kind of a fun one. Today we're going to be taking a look at a couple different X79 motherboards, and here's something for you. One of them is an original overclocking motherboard. Let's get into it, shall we? Okay. So, the whole idea of this video was actually kind of spurred on by me actually getting my hands on a legitimate overclocking X79 motherboard, something that I've never actually owned before. Primarily because I've never really thought that I would need one before. But as I was browsing my local market, somehow by a miracle, I found this. A Gigabyte GA UD3 X79 motherboard for only $61. And so, because of that, I just had to snatch it up as fast as I possibly could, because you know what? I thought this was going to be a fun little motherboard. Which kind of had me bring up this whole idea of, is there really a difference between this original overclocking motherboard and the Chinese motherboards? Well, I've done the same kind of thing with X58 boards, but I've never done it with X79. But it kind of had me thinking, is there actually going to be a massive performance difference between one of these older boards and a Chinese board? So, let me first introduce the motherboards, and then we'll talk about essentially all three of them in better detail. So, the first motherboard that we're going to be talking about today is my brand new Gigabyte GA X79 UD3 version 1.0. This motherboard is actually in surprisingly great shape, and has not as many features as you would probably expect. Having a UD3 motherboard is essentially having Gigabyte's kind of entry-level, high-end motherboard. Although it's got a pretty decent power delivery system, as well as a pretty decent just like build quality and setup, this motherboard is really nothing super fancy by any means. But now let's talk about a much fancier motherboard. The One X79 Deluxe 7.1. This motherboard is what I have called the best and nicest X79 motherboard that I've ever seen. It has built-in M.2 Wi-Fi as well as a built-in M.2 NVMe slot, meaning that you don't need any special adapters or workarounds. You can literally drop in an M.2 NVMe drive and it just works. As well as the fact that you can just drop in an M.2 Wi-Fi slot, or M.2 Wi-Fi card, and it just works. You can get Wi-Fi 6 on one of these things without taking up a PCIe slot, and it just works. I gotta keep saying that. And so, it's also got a built-in I/O shield, and surprisingly good built-in audio for being a Chinese motherboard. And in my opinion, probably one of the greatest motherboards that I've ever used. And now, finally, we have what I like to call El Cheapo, which is the first X79 motherboard I actually ever got. This motherboard can be had for right around $50 USD. You can find it from anywhere between like 50 and 55. It typically comes in this ugly green color. Sometimes it has an M.2 slot, other times it doesn't. But it is one of the base model X79 motherboards you can actually get. And the biggest downside of this motherboard is it actually only has a dual channel memory instead of the standard quad channel that you would expect on an X79 platform. But does that really keep it from being a great all-around use case motherboard? Well, let's talk about that, shall we? When it comes to performance of each motherboard, I decided to kind of pit them against each other in kind of like a battle to see which one was actually going to come out on top, as well as just to see the differences between one motherboard to the other. So for testing, I actually did this with the E5 1620 version 1, 16 gigs of DDR3 memory, that is desktop memory, running at 1600, as well as a 120mm AIO to keep the CPU cool. And for each test, I had decided to overclock the CPU to the furthest that the motherboard could actually take it, as well as using a GTX 980 Ti. And the benchmark that I decided to choose was Unigine Heaven. Now, the reason I chose Unigine Heaven was because it's actually a pretty good benchmark for finding a CPU bottleneck. Now, I could have ran something like 3D Mark Firestrike or 3D Mark TimeSpy, but the thing is, then that would have been putting way more of a load on the GPU than the actual CPU. And so I simply decided that Unigine Heaven was probably going to be the best option. I decided to run the test at 720p medium settings with my 980 Ti overclocked absolutely to the moon. as well as overclocking each of the CPUs as far as they would go, so I could really get the best overall performance when it came to each of these tests. So, the first motherboard that I tested was the Gigabyte UD3 motherboard. I was able to achieve a 4.5 GHz overclock at like 1.4 volts between base clock and multiplier overclocking, because for some reason the multiplier was only locked at 43, but you know, whatever. But I was able to get it up to 4.5 GHz stable with about 1690, I believe, on the RAM, and I left the RAM timing set to auto. For Unigine Heaven, I ended up getting a 299 average FPS with a 38 minimum, as well as a 534 maximum. Now, the next motherboard that I tested was the Huanin X79 Deluxe 7.1. This one was running at 4.2 GHz, which is the soft cap for all Chinese motherboards, as well as having the RAM run at 1600 in quad channel, with yet again auto RAM timings. The average was 289, the minimum was 37, and maximum was 487. Which kind of surprised me because the maximum was a lot lower, but the average was only 10 lower. But being the fact that that was running 300 megahertz slower, as well as the fact that the RAM was running a decent amount slower, overall it still gave a really good performance. And yet again, this is running it at 4.2 gigahertz versus 4.5. Also, I need to bring up voltage. Voltage for the UD3 motherboard was running at 1.4 volts, which isn't bad, because it was able to be maintained by a 120mm AIO, no problem. But running it at 4.3 on one of the Chinese motherboards, it only was running at 1.31 volts. And so because of that, the CPU temperature was significantly lower. But with that being said, is that something that really matters? Because, yet again, both CPUs were easily handled by the 120mm AIO. But because of the 7.1 running it at a much lower voltage, it was much cooler. And now finally, I tested El Cheapo. This one I kind of threw in because I just decided I wanted to see what the worst possible performance was going to be. Unfortunately, I should have just looked at the 7.1. Because for El Cheapo, I ran this test 4 times and got the same scores each time. El Cheapo got an average FPS of 292, with a minimum of 29 and a maximum of 499. I set it to 4.2 gigahertz, and the RAM was running at 1600 in dual channel. So how the heck did it outperform the 7.1? In fact, how the heck did it perform so close to the UD3? This is one thing that I could not wrap my head around. Because you would think that running dual channel RAM would have caused it to end up having a lower overall FPS, because these CPUs were designed with quad channel RAM in mind. But it didn't. It performed better. Also, for each of the motherboards, I did test them each 4 times and took the best runs from each motherboard. So I knew that it couldn't be something like there was an update going on in the background, because that would have affected more than one score, or I would have been able to see from a run-to-run variation. But each of the runs were within 1 to 2 FPS of each other for each particular motherboard. So evidently, El Cheapo is actually El Awesome, because I don't know. But this is kind of where the comparisons get more interesting, because let's be honest here, an E5-1620 V1 is going to perform like an E5-1620 V1. But the real differences in these motherboards doesn't come from performance, but honestly, I think it comes from feature set. Yet again, let's use El Cheapo as an example here. This motherboard has stereo audio. My particular board does not have an M.2 slot, although some of them do. It's got one PCI X16 slot and then one PCI X1 slot. This thing is cheap. This thing is designed cheaply, built cheaply, manufactured cheaply, and sent around the world cheaply. You can typically find this motherboard for anywhere between 45 to like 55 USD, and I wouldn't pay any more for it than that. This is one of the oldest models of X79 motherboards you can get, and I believe it is built on the same frame as the X79 Turbo, which means it's not a terrible motherboard, it's just very basic. And like I said, gigabit Ethernet, stereo audio, only USB 2. Nothing about it is all that fancy. But now let's talk about its counterpart, the Huanan X79 Deluxe. The reason it's called the Deluxe is because it is the nicest variation of the motherboard that you can get your hands on. Black cap capacitors all the way around the board. It's got 7.1 surround sound audio. It has USB 3, SATA 3, PCIe Gen 3. Actually, all the motherboards do have PCIe Gen 3. But this one actually has fully functioning, fully featured actual stuff on the motherboard, as well as having a built-in M.2 Wi-Fi slot and a built-in M.2 NVMe slot, meaning that you can drop in a NVMe drive into that slot and it's just going to work. Yes, it is PCIe Gen 3, not Gen 4, obviously because of the age of the motherboard. But that doesn't change the fact that you can literally drop in an M.2 slot and install Windows on it with no issue. And so, comparing these two Chinese motherboards really does just go to show how much nicer the Deluxe actually is. Having all of the features that you would expect and want out of a modern motherboard, including something like a built-in I/O shield, as well as active cooling on the VRMs. I have talked about how great I think the X79 Deluxe is. It also goes for something like the X79 Green, because I've talked about that one on my channel in the past. That motherboard also, it doesn't have an M.2 Wi-Fi slot, but it does have an M.2 SATA 3 slot. So you could end up pairing that thing with two M.2 drives, one SATA 3 and one NVMe. And it truly is fantastic just how great these motherboards have gotten in these last couple of years. Because remember, this is built on the LGA 2011 socket. It has all of the modern amenities that you would expect out of a, well, newer Chinese motherboard. But where both Chinese motherboards fall short is where the original Gigabyte motherboard actually comes out. Comes out on top, I should say. And that is overall BIOS and just utility of the BIOS, because the Gigabyte motherboard, while not being a totally super high-end overclocking board, actually has proper overclocking features without needing to mess around with the BIOS, as well as the fact that it has fan control for both DC and PWM fans, meaning you can use a 3-pin fan and actually control it via the motherboard's BIOS. It also has proper overclocking support, meaning that you can actually push the CPU as hard as you want to. But there is also one major drawback to going with something like the Gigabyte board, and the reason I use the E5-1620 version 1. Originally, I was going to run all of these tests with the E5-1680V2, but unfortunately, when I got my Gigabyte motherboard, I realized it is a version 1.0. A little bit of foreshadowing there. The version 1.0s can take both Sandy Bridge and Ivy Bridge Extreme Xeon, or take both Sandy Bridge and Ivy Bridge Extreme i7s, being something like the 3960X or the 4960X, but it can only take the first generation of Xeons, being the Sandy Bridge Xeons. It cannot take any of the Ivy Bridge, meaning no E5-1680V2, no E5-1650V2, no E5-2697V2. Meaning the CPUs that I was really hoping to test on that motherboard, I'm simply not going to be able to. Which is probably the biggest downside of what that motherboard has to offer. Now, I don't dislike my Gigabyte board. In fact, I think it's pretty awesome. But comparing the Gigabyte board's ease of use to something like the 7.1, the Huanan Deluxe 7.1, in my opinion, is just a far superior board. And in many senses, El Cheapo is a far superior board. I ran El Cheapo for a good couple of months with the E5-2697V2 inside of that board. Yes, this dinky little motherboard was able to keep an E5-2697V2 fully powered for weeks at a time, because I was running Windows Performance Mode, and essentially running that CPU at its all-core turbo of 3 GHz pretty much non-stop, and it handled it wonderfully, which is not something I could say about the Gigabyte board because it simply doesn't support it. Now, if you had a Gigabyte UD3 version 1.1, then yes, you could use something like an E5 2697 V2. But because I didn't get lucky with the board, because I didn't know about this initially, I ended up with a board that simply did not have the CPU that I wanted it to. But I can't exactly be mad because Gigabyte never intended for that motherboard to have those Xeons. So it's kind of immaterial either way. But I think I've probably rambled on enough about these motherboards, because ultimately at the end of the day, it really comes down to what you want to do with them. If you want a full-fledged overclocked system where pushing the CPU to the absolute edge of what it's capable of, then maybe getting an original overclocking board will do you good. But if you just want something that's going to work and still has overclocking support, something like the X79 Deluxe is not a bad choice. Or, honestly, any of the X79 motherboards. Unlike their X58 Chinese counterparts, Chinese X79 motherboards almost unanimously across the board support multiplier overclocking. I have not tested a motherboard that doesn't have support for multiplier overclocking, except for the dual socket motherboards. But you can't use an E516 series in those dual socket motherboards anyways. So that one, yet again, is kind of immaterial because it really does not matter. But I think I've probably been rambling enough for today, and yeah, I guess see you guys later. Peace.